Good afternoon. Thank you for joining my product demonstration. Today we're going to take a look at an Encore Business Solutions developed product, an add-on for Dynamics GP, Project Tracking with Advanced Analytics. Project Tracking with Advanced Analytics will help companies organize and oversee multiple projects. We work with all of the core modules within GP, so as you're entering your transactions in the general ledger, the bank reconciliation, sales order processing, inventory, invoicing, receivables management, purchase order processing, payables management, and the U.S. payroll module, you will be able to tag those transactions to projects. You will also be able to capture additional information as it relates to your projects. The information that you can capture at the time of transaction entry is decided upon by you. Project tracking is very easy to set up, install, and configure. It's highly recommended that you start with your end result, the reports that you would like to be able to pull out of project tracking, and work backwards from there, which will dictate how you will define your setup window. In my example here, I am tracking events within project tracking. So if we take a look at the top right-hand corner of the screen, we give you access to 7 transaction user-defined fields, and you can use as many of these fields as you require. I want to be able to track and report on the region, the city, and the project manager. Now, if I'm also registered for the optional budgeting add-on for project tracking, this field will become enabled, and I can create project budgets for any one of these values. So let's say I have an event that's taking place in multiple cities. By marking this checkbox when I create my project budget, the city field will become enabled where I can select the different cities that the event is taking place in and create a budget for each. Constant value just means that when I create my projects, I'm going to assign a value to this field that will remain constant for the life of the project, and I won't be able to change that value at the time of transaction entry. And these checkboxes, when you are creating your project master records, you can deselect them or select them based on the particular project. Another feature that I want to talk about briefly is the breakdowns. Highly recommended that you've got require breakdowns selected. Breakdowns are your revenue and your cost categories within project tracking. They're typically related to the natural account segment within your chart of accounts. If you are currently tracking projects within your chart of accounts, you more than likely have a segment within your chart of accounts that defines the project. And every time you start a new project, you define a new value for that segment, and then you create a whole list of GL codes relating to that project. With breakdowns, you would be able to eliminate that segment within your chart of accounts, and instead of adding a whole new range of GL codes for tracking project revenue and expenses, you would be able to limit that to a single GL code for each revenue and expense. So for instance, if travel expenses was something you were tracking for multiple projects, you would likely have multiple travel expense GL codes, one for each project. By adding in project tracking to your GP install, you would be able to limit your GL codes to one travel expense account. Anytime you're entering a transaction in GP that's for a travel expense, you would use that single GL code and then tag that transaction to a project and use the breakdown code called travel expense. Breakdowns are also the values that you're going to budget for within project tracking. Disable cross-project budget reporting. We'll talk about this option when we look at the budgeting today, so I won't get into that at this point. And these calculations here, you can automatically calculate a percentage of overhead when you run your project analysis reports. So this is a global setting in this window. You can override this when you create your projects, but in my example here, I want to report and calculate 2% of overhead based on the revenue that I tagged to the project, another 2% based on the labor, and 2% as it's based on material. So we'll see this report calculation when we look at our project analysis report. If you are using the GP revenue expense deferral module, project tracking can piggyback on those recognition entries. So if you're allocating $1,200 to a project expense and you've leveraged the functionality that GP provides, the revenue expense deferral module, and you're recognizing that revenue or expense over future periods, project tracking will do the same. So we will allocate $100 into each period. Security is handled through GP's tasks and roles, but you can also enable security within project tracking so that you can restrict users as far as which projects they can view, report on, if they have access to budgeting, etc. That can be handled through project tracking security. In addition to the 7 transaction user-defined fields, we also give you several user-defined fields, 7 checkbox, 7 numeric, 7 date, as well as 20 text fields. So in this window here is where you will enter your field labels, and you will see these fields when you create your projects. So that is it for the global setup window. The next step would be to define values for each of your transaction user-defined fields. So I've just created lists of values for each of these, for each of my regions that my projects are taking place in, the different cities and the different project managers. The next step would be to create the breakdown codes. Now breakdown codes, again, are based on the natural account segment typically within your chart of accounts. Some customers are only tracking expenses within project tracking, so if that's the case, you wouldn't need to create breakdown codes with different amount types. The amount type in the drop-down list is just dependent upon the module you're within GP. So if you think of a transaction and sales transaction entry, if you look at your GP distribution, you would have a line for the sales amount, for the revenue. If you've extended a trade discount to that customer, you would have a trade discount line, as well as if there was any freight, miscellaneous charge, or sales tax. So we trigger off of the GP distribution window, so any distribution lines relating to revenue or expenses will be pulled into our project tracking distribution window. So if you are tracking revenue, then you would set up amount types for sales. Now, estimated cost of labor and estimated cost of material are typically your cost of goods accounts. Actual cost of labor, actual cost of material, these are expense type transactions. So you would see these in purchase order processing or payables transaction entry. And so you would create a list of values for your different labor expenses. Maybe you've got like consulting expenses, different material expenses. If you're in the general ledger, they're all available to you. So it really is just dependent upon what type of transaction you're entering as far as which GP transaction entry window you're in. So in my example here for sales, I've got breakdown codes, registration, revenue, 50/50 raffle. I'm selling, I think, some promotional wear, so that's different revenue categories that I want to capture. So once that initial setup is done, so we've defined the setup window, we've defined the values for our transaction user-defined fields, and we defined our breakdown codes, we are then ready to create our project. So when I open the project maintenance window, we see those transaction user-defined field values or titles, pardon me, appear in the bottom part of the window, and my constant value is checked for project manager. So I can deselect and, select and deselect these values once I've populated my project. So let's take a project that I have created here for a GPUG event that I have happening throughout the United States. So all that's required is your project ID and your project description, unless you have something marked as constant, which in this case I do. I have assigned a project manager. And of course, the more information I enter here, the more information that will default to transaction entry, and the more information I'll be able to get out as far as my reporting. A relatively new feature that we've added to project tracking is this new Enable Project Breakdown. So if you're typically always tracking the same types of projects, but then you have maybe some other types of projects, maybe you've got some kind of internal marketing campaign going, or you have an internal office renovation and you want to track that within project tracking, those projects would have completely different breakdown codes than what you're typically tracking. So you may want to restrict at the project level which breakdown codes, so which revenue and cost codes are going to be available at the time of transaction entry. So with this new feature, you can do that. You would just enable your project breakdown, and then from here you would restrict. So when I come in here, I'm seeing everything that I have set up for all my different types of projects that I'm tracking. But for this particular project, the only revenue that I'm going to be capturing is going to be for promotional wear, 50/50 raffle, and registration revenue. So I've done that for my different breakdown codes. You can also assign defaults. So for this particular project, by default, I'm going to see engineer because that's where most of my labor expenses are right now, but I have also access to all of these different breakdown codes as well. So that way you can restrict, so you don't have a great big long list of breakdown codes that wouldn't even relate to a project. Also, by setting up these restricted lists of breakdown codes, when you go to create your project budget, those are the only values that you're going to see. Instead of having access to everything, you'll only see the breakdown codes that have been assigned to that particular project. So that's it for creating the project. Not a lot of information that needs to be populated here either. Here's those additional user-defined fields for storing information. Now, some additional setups before we enter a transaction, because I know this is going to come into play. I'm going to have some defaulting going on when I enter my transaction that I just want to talk about. These are brand new, not required to be set up, but for those customers that want to simplify the data entry for their GP users, they can complete some of this additional setup as well. So vendor breakdown, I've done an example here. For this particular vendor ID, Light, I am going to be purchasing IT support for the most part. And again, I've got a restricted list of values that I might be, or expenses that I might be allocating when assigning a project for this vendor. So you can do that for your different vendors. Again, not required setup, but optional. And then you can also do some GL breakdown as well. So some customers have that one-to-one relationship. Like you might have, a particular GL code for travel expense, and then the only breakdown code that you want to be able to assign is travel expense. So in this example here, if this GL code exists in the GP distribution window, then for the most part it's going to be for pre-construction deposit, but it might just be cash received. So you can do that as well. Now, some customers I've seen have a very restricted, or pardon me, a very general chart of accounts. They've got a GL code for project revenue and another GL code for project expenses, and they capture all of the detail within project tracking. So if that's the case, they wouldn't complete this breakdown. But if you have that one-to-one or one-to-few relationship, then you might want to consider setting up the GL breakdown maintenance. Okay, so let's see how this all comes together. I'm just going to enter in a payables invoice transaction. And as I'd mentioned, we use the native GP transaction entry windows. So I'm going to select that vendor Light. And I've entered in a $300 invoice here. So if we know that our distribution accounts have all defaulted incorrectly, we can just go ahead and assign this to project tracking at this point, which we can access from the main transaction entry window. But if we need to modify the distribution, we can come into the payables transaction entry distribution window. And I'm going to close that. That is another Encore product that we're not talking about today. So if I needed to modify this in any way, maybe I needed to break out this expense between a couple of distribution accounts, I would update this window first, because this is the window that we trigger off of. So we can access the project distribution window from here as well. And we see my breakdown code has defaulted for this vendor for IT support. So this is the same window that will open regardless where you are in GP. This is the window that opens from the general ledger, from the bank rec, from US payroll, purchase order processing. We will pull whatever exists in the GP distribution window into the project tracking distribution window so you can assign it to projects. So I just need to come in here and select the project that this transaction is going to be assigned to. The GL code is pulled from the GP distribution window. My breakdown code is already assigned because I had a default set up. And I just need to assign the rest of the values that did not default in for me. So we see my project manager came from the project as I had assigned it there as a constant. So I just need to assign the region and the city. And this is complete. Now, if this expense should be assigned to 2 projects or multiple projects, I can just change the amount here until I've allocated appropriately to different projects. The only GL code that I am going to see in my GL account lookup is the GL codes that exist as expense lines within the GP distribution window. So you will always have that one-to-one relationship between the GP distribution window and the project tracking distribution window. If you make a change in the GP distribution window, you will be warned if you try to post the transaction that everything's out of sync and you'll need to correct your GP distribution. Okay, let's take a quick look at the budgeting before we take a look at some of the reporting that's available within Project Tracking. So when I open this window, we see my period duration is based on fiscal, and we saw this checkbox in the setup window, so I just wanted to talk about that briefly. If I mark that checkbox, the period duration field becomes enabled, and that gives me the ability to create my project budgets based on different periods other than the company's fiscal year. You do give up something doing this, though. If all of your project budgets are based on your company fiscal year, then you can do some powerful cross-project budget reporting. If your project budgets are not based on the company fiscal year, those project budget reports can only be reported on a single project at a time, or you can do a multi-project, so it's basically a summary, one project after another on a single report. But any projects that are based on fiscal year, you can do a cross-project budget reporting report. So that's just something to be aware of. You might have most of your projects based on a period duration of fiscal, but you may have a short-term project that you just want to do with a single period budget, and that's fine. You can have a combination of the both, but those will not be included in the cross-project budget reporting. I'm just going to pull up a project budget for that GPUG project. Now this window can be populated via the optional add-on importer as well, so you can create your project budget outside of GP. Or you can manually enter it. There's filters so that you can restrict what you're looking at within the window so it's not overly busy. Once your budget has been saved and approved, if you're making any changes, if you come back into this window, you'll be prompted to save it as a new revision, or if you try to import into an approved budget, it will save it as a new revision as well. So you may have multiple revisions of a project budget. When you're reporting, you can select which revision you want to report against. You can also add revision notes. So if you've got, like I've got 3 revisions here, I might have a note on each revision as to why I have a new revision of the project budget. And you can also add notes for each of the cells. So if one period I'm increasing it and that's got a new revision, I can put a note as to why I've changed the budgeted amount from the previous revision. Actuals will update as transactions are posted, so anything that is sitting unposted within GP will not update the actual, so it must be posted. Purchase orders will not be reported as actuals until you've actually received against that PO and posted that receiving. At that point, your actual will be updated. Okay, so let's take a look at the reports. We'll take a look at the project analysis report. So I'm just looking at a single project here. I'm printing this in summary, and this would be your project P&L report. So in the first column, anything that I've assigned to the amount type of sales by breakdown code, so my revenue, now I've got all my labor expenses by breakdown code and all my material expenses by breakdown code. And then this is that overhead calculation. So at the bottom of the report, my revenue less my expenses and operating expenses for a net profit or loss for this project. And this report, when you run it, you can also put GL posting date or document date restrictions as well. Let's look at one of my 7 transaction user defined fields I had defined as region, and I had set up a region value of Midwest. So if I just want to look at my expenses for any projects in the Midwest region, I can do that with this report as well. So I will get that same summary information, one project after another, and then at the very bottom of the report, a grand total for everything that has been assigned to projects within the Midwest region. And let's take a look at a budget. So here I'm just looking at my single GPUG project. I want to run this report on my latest revision, but I could select a specific revision, and I can do a period selection. So I can current period, prior period, a period range, or all periods. And I'm just going to first of all run this very summarized just by amount type. The first 4 columns on the report are based on my period selection. So we're going to look at the prior period first, and then the 4 columns are repeated on the report, and they are the life-to-date values for the project. So on the same report, I've got my actual budget variance and variance percent for my prior period and the project to date. I can also pull in, any of these other available groupings, a breakdown code that will give me the detail by breakdown. So by amount type by breakdown. Now, if your budgets were all based on company fiscal, you could do the cross-project reporting. And I just want to quickly show you the advanced analytics. We do ship now with SmartList objects for project tracking, so you can get a lot of this information out of the SmartList. But I just wanted to show you the advanced analytics, which is kind of cool. Basically the same information you're going to get out of SmartList, but once you've built your queries here, you have different options as far as exporting this information. So once you've built the query, you can send this information out to Excel, XML, HTML, or to a text file. Your queries can be saved as favorites, so if every time you're coming in and you're running the same queries, you can have some favorites set up. So you just define your query here. So this is very similar to if you were going and querying the project tracking tables through SQL Query Analyzer. So define the information that you want returned to you, and then click refresh. Now if there's additional information, you can right-click and select the column chooser, and you can pull on some additional fields. So breakdown codes, I also have those transaction user-defined fields. And now we can pull headers up into the grouping section, so we can do some grouping. We can put multiple groupings. This is just very rough, but you get the idea. I've already put my functions here, so I've got functions added the sums for each of the subgroups as well as a grand total. And from here you also have your drill back ability. So there's a payables invoice and the same additional project distribution. We can see how this transaction had been assigned. So that is a very high-level overview of project tracking. If you're interested in learning more and you would like to arrange for a personal demo, please email sales@encorebusiness.com and we'd be happy to help you out. Thanks very much for your time.